On September 9th, 2013, a man named LaShawn Martin was arrested for allegedly attacking two men in Union Square, Manhattan. Of the two men whom Martin attacked, one, Jeffrey Babbitt, aged 64, was killed as a result of his injuries, and the other was taken to the hospital. Moments before the attack, Martin shouted that he hated white people and that he would punch the first white person he saw in the face. Both of his victims were white. Now, some of my culturally unenriched viewers out there may be tempted to say that this attack was a racist hate crime. That would certainly be the case if the roles were reversed, if it was a white guy who expressed hatred towards minorities and then punched a black guy in the face. However, if you had checked your privilege like you were supposed to, you would know that only white people are capable of being racist, and that so-called reverse racism, which is when minorities express bigotry towards white people, does not in fact exist. Now, you can be forgiven if you haven't been keeping up with the latest developments in the social justice narrative. As we all know, it's a constant struggle, so many of you are probably a bit perplexed about all of this. You might think that, well, if a statement is racist, it doesn't matter if it was uttered by a white guy, or a black guy, or a Chinese guy, or a Latino, it's still just as racist. Well, let's try to set aside our common sense for a minute and attempt to see things from a delusional social justice warrior's perspective. Here's a helpful diagram I dredged up from the bottom of the internet to help illustrate the definition of racism according to SJWs. As you can see, racism is the structural oppression of non-whites through government legislature, cultural norms, representation of the media, whereas racism is not a black girl made fun of me in middle school. Okay, I don't know about you guys, but this diagram doesn't really get the point across. I fail to see how these two are mutually exclusive. So let's consult the highest intersectional authorities on this matter. Here's a Tumblr blog about women of color, and guess what? They're in solidarity. They should be able to clear this matter up. And wouldn't you know, they've conveniently defined racism as a mathematical equation. Because, Lord knows, if there's one thing us shitlords understand, it's math. So according to these proud, independent women of color, prejudice equals a feeling of dislike for a racial, ethnic group, plus belief in this dislike. Discrimination equals prejudice plus actions that harm those you have prejudice against. And finally, racism equals discrimination plus institutionalization of this discrimination, which is then perpetuated in society. Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. From what I gather, these people define racism not as a prejudice against a certain ethnicity per se, but as a prejudice combined with institutional oppression. Alright, but let's read a bit further. Now, pay attention here, because this slide is important. This is where they explain why white people cannot be the victims of racism. They write, white people have privilege because they benefit from institutionalized racial oppression of people of color. The fact that every white person benefits from this continued legacy of racism is called white privilege. Racism against white people is not real because there are no institutions that are set into place against white people on the basis of their whiteness. I don't know who the hell thought up reverse racism and started using it as a defense to continue white supremacist ideals, but it's bullshit. You hear me? Oh, I hear you, Lakeisha. Now, before you guys roll your eyes, let's try to read this thing charitably for a second. Clearly, This person is referring to some sort of alternate universe where the Barbary slave trade, the Nation of Yahweh, the Rhodesian Bush War, the Devshirme, and the Nation of Islam never existed. When you've sipped as much of the social justice Kool-Aid as this person has, you begin to realize that white people are the devil and are engaged in a malicious conspiracy to enslave all the other races. That's what you have to understand, folks. White people are the inherent oppressors, so it's impossible for them to be the victims of racism. So I think we can finally piece together just what these social justice crusaders mean when they say that reverse racism doesn't exist. According to these people, in order to be a racist, not only do you have to be a bigot, but you need to belong to a privileged class in society. And as we all know from Tumblr, black people cannot be racist because they are the victims of institutional oppression and thus are not a privileged class. So when LaShawn Martin shouted in a public square that he hated white people and then proceeded to beat a white man to death, he wasn't being racist. No, Martin was merely expressing his systematic marginalization by lashing out against his colonial oppressors. But in all seriousness, this view that one group is automatically assumed to be racist by default, and that all their actions and words need to be constantly scrutinized, and that they should be accosted for the smallest expression of bias, whereas the other group gets a blank check to be as bigoted as they please, is absolutely fucking ridiculous. This is just a microcosm of the standard SJW tactic of holding different individuals to different standards based on the groups that they belong to. I do agree with the women of color in solidarity that there are economic disparities between white people and black people, just as there are disparities between white people and Asian people, or people in rural areas and people in urban areas, or attractive people and unattractive people. But just because one group is in a different situation than another group does not necessarily imply that one group is being systematically oppressed. The economist Thomas Sowell makes this point in his book Intellectuals and Race when he writes, "Where there has been a degeneration in behavior, however, whether in falling test scores or rising crime or other indicators, this has seldom been correlated with the kinds of factors that have widely been used as explanations, such as poverty or discrimination. Some of the most visible and persistent degeneration, such as skyrocketing crime rates among blacks in the 1960s, occurred when poverty and discrimination were becoming demonstrably less severe." So even though there was a lot more discrimination before the civil rights movement of the 1960s, there were fewer disparities. In his book, Thomas Sowell directly contradicts the notion that the disparities that exist between whites and blacks are somehow the result of systematic discrimination by white people. The inequalities that exist today are instead due to other factors. There is scant evidence to suggest that white people benefit from some kind of institutional racial hierarchy, as these Tumblr denizens would have you believe. Without this notion of whites as benefiting from institutional oppression at the expense of minorities, the arguments put forth by social justice warriors that reverse racism doesn't exist simply fall flat. Of course black people can be racist, as can any group of people. Just because these anointed special snowflakes point to a few disparities between two groups does not automatically infer institutional discrimination. Nor does it give one group a carte blanche to act like a bunch of bigoted assholes. This idea being advocated by SJWs, that reverse racism doesn't exist, is not only demonstrably wrong, but it's also dangerous. As history has shown, if you can convince one group of people that they are being institutionally oppressed by another group, then this can be used as an excuse for the oppressed group to commit heinous atrocities. A perfect example of this is the Rwandan genocide. For many years prior to the Rwandan genocide, the Tutsis were seen by the Hutus as the elite class in Rwanda. This led the Hutus to seek retribution for alleged injustices, and fueled resentment between the two groups. The Hutus saw themselves as victims of Tutsi oppression, and so many Hutu elite framed the genocide of 1994 as a way of evening the playing field between the two groups. The Hutus didn't see themselves as being racist. No, they were just redressing historical injustices. According to them, even the most egregious acts of violence against Tutsis are justified because the Hutus were the ones being systematically oppressed, historically. This is the kind of sick, twisted mentality that leads a man to murder children with machetes. And this is the same line of reasoning that social justice warriors will use to argue that white people cannot be victims of racism. By assuming that whites are the oppressor class, they will justify behavior committed by blacks against whites while condemning the very same behavior committed by whites against blacks. Look, I'm not saying that social justice warriors want to go out and murder white kids with machetes. At least most of them don't. But that's where you end up when you take their racist double standard to its logical extreme. Racism has nothing to do with some elaborate Marxist theories about power structures or institutional oppression. It solely involves holding people to different standards based on their ethnic background. The reason that racism is abhorrent is because you are judging someone based on genetic factors that they had no control over, as opposed to their actions or their character. Acts of racism are no more excusable or justifiable when they are committed by a minority than if they were committed by a white person. If social justice warriors want to redefine racism based on arbitrary distinctions, then they are no less prejudiced and no less abhorrent than the bigotry that they claim to be fighting against.